So the title, of course, is stolen from Stephen Coslin, who a few years back gave a talk, if neuroimaging is the answer, what is the question? And so one of the things that I spend time with is, as many of you actually know, because many of you are in my class, is teaching social neuroscience. And social neuroscience seems to be fairly straightforward for many people. The neuroscientific study of social processes, okay, we can end the talk and go. The point of the talk today is actually in the general context that this symposium spans about the relationship between neuroscience, psychology, and the humanities, in the sense that social neuroscience is probably a very different thing. It is different things to different people. And what I try to do today is disentangle a little bit the different interpretations of what social neuroscience actually is. So if you read a statement like this, social neuroscience is arguably the most revolutionary, forward-looking development in 21st century science. Nothing compares with its ability to integrate mind, body, and social behavior. That sounds pretty strong. Strong to the point where you wonder, is this hype? Can anything be actually real in a statement such as that? Now, she was not paid for that. I think she probably was paid 2 books from Psychology Press for being a reviewer for the volume. But she is actually very excited, as are many other serious researchers in the field. Now, why is that? Why is social neuroscience suddenly such a big and interesting thing? So the way I want to tell the story is by starting to go back in time. Now, some of you will recognize what we are looking at. For the older ones, this refers to a model of the original time machine used in the film The Time Machine. And for the younger ones, this is, of course, the Big Bang Theory, which uses that prop. So let's just use the time machine and go back like, what, 120, 130 years, and go back to William James, Wundt, and Darwin. And actually, if you would have talked to these people, they would have been quite knowledgeable about what there was to know in neuroscience at the time. They knew all of it, because all of it was something that a single person who was smart and who had access to books could know. They were actually polymath, so they would know things about many different disciplines, biology, the nascent psychology, and this would provide a very integrative overview. So what do we have today? Today we have something like that, where every dot on this cloud is basically a sub-discipline related to a journal. This is from an analysis that tried to network the way that people cite each other in papers to see what types of disciplines cluster together. And you can see little labels. So for example, we have here neurology, biomedicine, neuroscience. It's this little blob here. And we have these big black things: medicine, earth sciences, chemistry, physics, math, social sciences, and psychology. This is basically the structure of science. Not by the way that it is defined by people, but by the way what people actually do, what they write, and how they relate to each other. If we go into psychology, this is what it looks like through the eyes of the American Psychological Association. There are 54 different interest groups or subgroups, each with their own journals, their own conferences. They don't talk to each other. We have the Society of Counseling Psychology, School Psychology, Clinical Neuropsychology, Health Psychology, Developmental Psychology, Experimental. Nobody can know all of that. That is only within psychology. So one might wonder, do we have the problem where actually a field is falling apart? Where something like psychology, and all of you know, of course, about psychology, falls apart because these different people speak partially different languages, use different terms, and are not aware of each other's findings? Or is it actually a more appropriate metaphor that this whole thing is going to blow up, that the whole field is going to go supernova? Well, as a matter of fact, there are people who worry about these things. And if you go into psychology departments, and this is, for some of you, will be fairly abstract because you go into a department to learn and to take courses, so you don't see all of the going-ons that are in there about the way that jobs are distributed, about the politics and all of that. They are falling apart. You have factions that don't communicate well with each other. So there are some people who try to counter this stuff, to try to reduce, if you will, the forces that tend to blow these things apart. And one of them is, as some of you know, my personal hero, one of my personal heroes, John Cacioppo, I am not embarrassed to say so, who does all kinds of interesting things. And in this particular case, this is from a year when he was the president of the Association for Psychological Science, and he published a series of papers on the state of psychological science. In this particular issue of The Observer, he discussed psychology as a hub science, so where he said, psychology has a particular role to play in the connection to other sciences. It is a very important science that relates to many things in the public interest, in applications, and psychologists should be aware of that. Here's a quote, and I will read the whole quote. The more this relates to the map that you saw before with all of those different disciplines. The more insular the field, the closer a field will lie to the outside of the map. Those with many interdisciplinary linkages are more likely to lie toward the middle of the map. It is interesting, therefore, to note that psychiatry, law, political science, and economics all lie along the outside, whereas psychology is closer to the middle, reflecting its interdisciplinary nature. Another map depicting the linkages among scientific fields confirmed that psychology is a hub science, that is, a discipline in which scientific research is cited by scientists in many other fields. For instance, medicine draws from psychology most heavily through neurology and psychiatry, whereas the social sciences draw directly from most of the specialties within psychology. So just as an idea, when I was in Canada and I was applying for money, psychology was the only discipline where you could apply to all the three major research councils, the one for social sciences and humanities, the Medical Research Council, and science and engineering, because as a psychologist, you can do stuff that relates to all of that. So psychology is a great thing. Why should it fall apart? Well, here's from a newsletter that is just a few months later, where he talked about the structure of psychology, and he quotes a very critical colleague who says, psychology lacks a clear identity. So this is not Cacioppo, he's quoting someone. Psychology lacks a clear identity. It is a federation of often unrelated disciplines placed in one administrative category during the first century of existence because each could be defined by taking an experimental approach to the study of human behavior. Some of the vectors along which the subdisciplines have matured are separated by such obtuse angles to one another, and as the distance between them grows, they strain against the departmental membrane and are irritated by the requirements of common membership in a distended administrative unit. Social and biopsychology are an example. Most biopsychology students consider a core course in social psychology to be an impediment. I assume that our students in social psychology reflect that sentiment about their core experience in biopsychology. Now, some of you are aware, when you take courses here in cognitive psychology or in social psychology, that there seem to be different ways how people go about things. And what we try to do here, of course, is to integrate these things and try to pull them together. And social neuroscience, the way that some people see that, does exactly that and promises exactly that. This is one of the graphics that Cacioppo uses. Now, on the left hand, you see the Principles of Psychology, published in 1890 by William James. He had the luxury of basically inventing a discipline. He just made up whole fields of psychology. Psychology of religion, yeah, we should have that. The psychology of education, great. Now, Cacioppo somebody very much aware of symbolic things, publishes exactly 100 years later, in 1990, a book called The Principles of Psychophysiology, Physical, Social, and Inferential Elements. It's a book, actually it's edited by Cassioppo and Tessineri, that brings together different methods that are used in psychophysiology. At that time, psychophysiology was a very established field, which sort of organized itself in the 1950s. One of the figures, and many of you know that figure, I use it all the time, is from one of the intro chapters by Cassioppo and Tessineri that talks about the concept of levels and a multi-level analysis. How we can and should look at human behavior by trying to look not only at individual levels, such as molecular levels, cellular levels, the body level, behavior, or social behavior in context, but by trying to understand how those different levels relate to each other. So, for example, we heard 2 talks that touched upon depression. You can look at depression at a molecular way. You try to understand the types of neurotransmitters that are involved. You look about structures that are involved in doing that. You can look at the behavioral consequences of depression. You can look at how it disrupts the way that people relate to each other and how you might deal with that. And what they try to argue is that by trying to put levels together, we may learn more than individual levels. So in 1992, they published, in this case it is Cassioppo and his colleague Gary Burnson, a paper in the American Psychologist, which is a journal that every American psychologist and many others would also receive as the standard journal, a very programmatic paper, Social Psychological Contributions to the Decade of the Brain, the Doctrine of Multilevel Analysis. And they state, and we heard today already several allusions to the decade of the brain also in the last talk, the 1990s were declared by Congress to be the decade of the brain. This declaration is important to all psychologists, not only neuroscientists, because with this declaration come expectations of the cognitive and behavioral sciences generally, and because the brain does not exist in isolation, but rather is a fundamental component of developing and aging individuals who themselves are mere actors in the larger theater of life. This article examines the importance of a multi-level integrative approach to the study of mental and behavioral phenomena in the decade of the brain, reviews how this approach highlights the synergistic relationship between theoretical and clinically relevant research, and illustrates how this approach can foster the transition from micro-theories to general psychological theories. When they say general psychological theories, there is a romantic notion of the type of theories that somebody like William James would have had, somebody like Piaget would have had, or in a worst case, somebody like Freud would have had. The big theories, which we see very rarely, for very good reasons. So somewhere buried in this paper, as a headline of a section, is social neuroscience, ? And this is where it comes from. This is where the name came from, but it was not really developed there. This came much later. Now, where this leads to is, this is, for example, the cover page of last year's convention issue for the Association for Psychological Science, which is like a key conference where everything comes together. And as you can see here, it actually did come together because the topic of the conference was convergence, connecting levels of analysis in psychological science. And you have different scientists who are sort of linked metaphorically. Here we have Giacomo Rizzolatti, who obviously is very important for the concept of mirror neurons, trying to bring all of that together. So what they try to do is to realize this fantasy of a real multi-level discipline. Now, in reality, this was not invented in the 1990s. This has many, many precursors. And in the case of Cassioppo, this probably goes back to a concept of social psychophysiology, something that he pushed for in the 1980s, and some researchers in Europe did as well, which in a way, goes back even further. And here's a quote by William James. To begin with, no reader of the last 2 chapters will be inclined to doubt the fact that objects do excite bodily changes by a pre-organized mechanism, or the further fact that the changes are so indefinitely numerous and subtle that the entire organism may be called a sounding board, which every change of consciousness, however slight, may reverberate. The various permutations and combinations of which these organic activities are susceptible make it abstractly possible that no shade of emotion, however slight, should be without a bodily reverberation as unique when taken in its totality as is the mental mood itself. What he says is that there is an assumption that there are bodily changes and that these bodily changes relate to mental states, in this particular case, emotions. So if we look at the body, we can understand the mind. This is the principal mantra of psychophysiology. Rather than trying to understand how a particular system works, it is, let us use our understanding of how systems work to understand the mind, basically. We try to understand psychology by looking at bodily changes, because there's a fundamental assumption that bodily changes and mental processes are closely linked, that they may be different sides of a coin. And Professor Roth has talked in his talks here about these types of how we can conceptualize this, and probably will also do in the third part for those who have not attended it. There's a lot of philosophy that goes behind it, but there's a very clear assumption by these scientists that if we look at the body, we can understand the mind. Now, the body today means also the brain, but it does not mean exclusively the brain. Many of these people would argue that it is not sufficient to look only at the central activation to understand certain changes. So, for example, in the talks about depression, there was research at the Max Planck Institute for Psychiatry that showed changes in facial behavior as therapy would progress. So if we know that and we use that information with information that we can now get from brain activity in the living brain and peripheral responses and put all of that together, we might get a much better understanding of how a patient is progressing, for example. Because the brain is embodied. If you go to these conferences, APS or whatever, there will be a large number of sessions these days on embodied processes that try to understand how the fact that the brain is not floating in ether, but is connected to a body, actually affects it. And I can talk 2 hours on that, and I don't have them, so I will jump on, but saying that in this whole idea of how psychophysiology works, psychophysiologists have identified methodology, and I'm not talking about machines, but I'm talking about paradigms, how you can link physical processes and psychological processes, trying to overcome the fact that very often a particular physical symptom is associated with several psychological processes, something that Cassiopo would talk a many-to-many relationship. What we see here are diagrams where the left bubble always refers to psychological processes and the right bubble physiological processes. And in a way, this figure shows how they might be related. I will give you a concrete example. We have here 4 psychological processes, and you cannot read it, I will read it for you. We have relaxation, we have orienting, we have startle, and defense. These are things that physiologists were very excited about a few decades ago. All of those will change the body, and you will find a phasic physiological response. Any of these 4 will do that. So we cannot use simply saying there is a response by saying which of the 4 it is. So we have to try to identify how we can separate them. So we could separate, for example, by using two measures, by using skin resistance, skin conductance, any type of electrodermal activity, actually, and heart rate. And we find that, yes, we find a link between all of these four processes to a phasic heart rate response, but only 3 of them elicit a skin conductance response. In relaxation, there is no such thing. That's already good. We continue this exercise and we see, well, if we split the heart rate response in heart rate response going up or going down, we can separate further. We now know that relaxation is associated with no skin conductance response. We know that orienting is associated with a skin conductance response and a slowing down of heart rate. And both startle and defense are associated with skin conductance response and an acceleration. And then if we try to look into the acceleration, we can find that there's an abrupt or a more lingering acceleration. And if we separate our physiological measures like that, we have achieved a link, supposedly, between the psychological state and a physiological pattern that would allow us the inverse inference. So if we have a particular pattern, then we assume that there is a particular psychological process. This is important for neuroscience as well, because there are neuroscience papers that you're going to read where people will argue, well, we have amygdala activation, and that means something. But the amygdala, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, these are all structures which are involved in a large variety of processes. We rarely find this type of analysis that tries to separate in a matrix what would I need to find in order to draw conclusions that tell more than a consistent story, because it is easy to do that. So one of the things that Cassiopo and colleagues would argue for is what we have learned via physiology should and could be applied in neuroscience as well, so that we can identify what would be just a correlate or what would be a marker, a terminology that is hardly present in neuroscience. So I know that my time is over before I even come to the real neuroscience, but we have seen already here that a psychological subdiscipline, which is also a neuroscience subdiscipline, would have much to say about how we can conduct neuroscience in a way that we can use it to draw conclusions on psychological processes. So we have now like 22 minutes. 23, okay. I'll take 2 more minutes. As some of you know, I'm very much interested in social processes. And social processes are processes that happen not only when people think of something they see on a slide, but real social situations, something that is rarely realized in research. A friend of mine does an interesting line of research where he has people who receive foot shock in the scanner, and he looks at how the anticipation and the response to the shock looks in the brain. If the wife of the person is holding the hand of the subject while they are in the scanner, as opposed to somebody they don't know or somebody or nobody. And you can show how that differentiates things. What I would like to do is put much more of the social situation of the scanning and all of that surrounding, what we know about social relationships into the scanner and achieve what some of these people want to do. So let me go to the final slide. If you're more interested in that, where's the end key? If you're more interested than that, apart from taking, of course, the highly interesting social neuroscience course, there's no question about that, since 2010, there is a new society, which is called the Society for Social Neuroscience. They have a website, and I recommend to you to look at it, look at the mission of the society. They organize a conference now. That is one way of doing that. But if you go into the literature, not everybody who uses that term social neuroscience will talk about this whole way of thinking about this that I try to touch upon. Some people actually will simply look at brain changes when people think about social stimuli or so. But it is much more, or it could be much more, and that is my talk. Thank you.